with nature.
Hold that pose! Kamisato out! Sometsu! Take flight!
Wind strike.
So with AYAKA's upcoming rerun, I asked in a community post for you guys to send questions in, and we got quite a few, so I'll go through those. But before I get into it, as you may or may not know, I've done quite a bit of popular AYAKA theory crafting over the years. So if you want to check out some more of my work, there's some videos on YouTube you can check out. There's also my written guide on the KQM website. This is updated for 4.1. And there's a lot of teams, rotations and calcs here. And I've also got a channel in my Discord called #guides, where I've got direct links to some of the useful stuff anyway. So you can check this channel out for AYAKA and even some other characters too. Especially since this video in particular might not cover every single question you may have. So first of all, this guy got the most thumbs up and they're asking a bunch of basic questions, so it's good to start off with this. So AYAKA versus non-freezable enemies. And you probably want to know my opinion of when to play certain teams and how effective she can be even when you can't freeze enemies. So the general rule of thumb is to play freeze in a normal abyss that has lots of AoE chambers, and to play mono cryo when there's quite a few bosses you have to face. Because when you're facing unfreezable enemies like bosses, you're losing out on the freeze buff that AYAKA gets from her artifact set. You also lose out on the main freeze utility you would get from playing a Hydro teammate. Here's two examples of freeze teams. And here's an example of a mono cryo team. Obviously Bennett is just a healer buffer here, so he doesn't really count. And you could also play Charlotte here now instead. As for how AYAKA fares in content, even in freezable or non-freezable abysses, it really does depend on the teams you've assembled, your skill, your investment level, and it even does depend on the content. For example, we've even got recent enemies like Consecrated Beast, Hydra Hypostasis, Local Legends. And these enemies can be frozen, but they get unfrozen fast. And this can also be affected by your teammates. For example, Mona can be a bit more sketchy, keeping enemies frozen compared to Kokomi. And even recently with Furina, I find you can run into instances where enemies are unfreezing and ungrouping themselves too. And even Heralds and Lectors, once you get into the shield breaking phases, unless it's the Hydro Herald, you can't freeze these guys anymore. So the point is, even when AYAKA can freeze enemies, things don't always play out the same way. But your question is about non-freezable enemies in particular, so I can give my perspective, which is in 4.2, how strong is AYAKA versus non-freezable enemies and bosses. But I would say even that does depend on your investment level, and Genshin really does work this way. It really does depend on the HP thresholds you can hit. The way I think of it is, at the end of the day, AYAKA's burst has always been an extremely high amount of damage in a short time. So even though she is normally seen as a freeze AoE focus character, if you have strong enough builds to basically one rotate a boss, then she is still extremely strong. And you don't necessarily need constellations for most bosses too. Like these older clips I'm showing, I just have mistsplitter and C0, but I have the right team and I have good artifacts. But obviously the game isn't that simple. There can be two issues, I would say. Either the bosses are getting more and more HP, like some of these newer ones, even some with higher resistances too, or you don't have good enough investment yet. So if you have a weaker account with AYAKA, similar to Child International, Melt Ganyu, and all sorts of old teams, these are teams with high ceiling DPSs who scale very well with better artifacts and better investment. And that can be pretty true. Like a lot of newer Dendro teams, like this team for example, these are designed to have higher floors and feel more complete at minimum investment compared to older teams which have lower floors but require a bit more work to get going. But I would say what's not true is the misconception that AYAKA cannot keep up. At the end of the day, there's different types of accounts and different objectives you have. There are some teams that have high floors and some teams that have higher ceilings. And for hardcore players, there are people every patch getting insane AYAKA speed runs at both lower budgets and higher budgets. And for casual players, AYAKA Freeze is still almost always very popular in usage rates. And to be honest, that does make sense. You can't always think about casual players in terms of just low investment. Freeze is always going to be a pretty easy playstyle in Genshin. You have your grouping, you have your freeze, which basically makes you take barely any damage. So overall, I think in a very broad sense, she is still very strong. It just depends on your perspective. Like I said, strength doesn't really have one definition. It's not just about which teams work at the lowest investment. It can also be things like which teams have very good quality of life and utility. Are they easier to play? Do they scale with some investment? Do they have speedrun potential? There's a lot of things that can go into it. So the next question is, how much can we really expect of Shenhe versus Rosaria? So again, broadly speaking, Shenhe ranges from quite better to just not even a comparison to Rosaria, depending on your investment. I've covered Shenhe in a couple videos now, so I do recommend watching those if you do want a more detailed explanation from me. I know when Shenhe released, there was some belief that she was very similar to Rosaria, but to be honest, the Genshin community was a lot more younger then, and I think people know by now the strength of Shenhe, and I always say her strength isn't really something you can calculate. What she does have is a ton of buffs and debuffs. It's basically small amounts of buffs and debuffs all over her kit. But also what she does is she opens up more flexibility for AYAKA. As you may know, you usually start a setup with her skill and burst, and then you set up the rest of the team, and then after AYAKA's burst you bring Shenhe back to reuse her skill. She has two versions of the skill. Tapping will have lower damage, but it has a shorter cooldown, whereas hold will increase your DPS window, but you're basically going all in and risking it for a longer cooldown. And when you're doing either with Shenhe, what you're basically doing is you're generating a lot of cryo particles and potentially Favonius particles too, if you're using that weapon. And the fact that you're doing all this whilst it being optimal to switch to Shenhe for your team's damage is what sets her apart from others, I would say. Whereas with Rosaria in a team like this, yes, she can battery AYAKA, but bringing Rosaria on field is going to be weaker than just staying on AYAKA. There is also the old misconception that Shenhe is bad in AoE. And whilst it's true that this icy quill part of her kit is limited the more enemies you face, this is only part of her kit. You're still getting all the rest of this in AoE, and I think it's very important to consider that since Shenhe's power budget in a team like this is focused on buffing AYAKA a ton, and the fact that AYAKA is the real source of AoE damage in your team. So what that means is, it means Shenhe's power budget is still scaling in AoE, because the stronger your AYAKA is, the more value you get out of Shenhe. In comparison, adding another sub DPS here, for example Kaya, who won't have as much buffs as Shenhe, even if you can get him to do more damage, his damage has got nothing to do with how much damage AYAKA is doing. And the last question you're asking is a very useful one. It's the priority optimization when increasing gold costs, like should you get C2 first before getting Shenhe or mistsplitter. So I have covered something similar to this before in my written guide, but I can say many AYAKA mains have been vertically investing. Like for example myself, I have a C2 now, but to sum up optimization priority, basically mistsplitter is always the #1 priority, and it can be even stronger than pulling all the different teammates. I'm sure you've seen in my weapon calcs, you can see just how strong mistsplitter is. It's still very strong even though we've got a new 4-star weapon here. But although I've got C2 AYAKA, I can tell you that actually C1 on Shenhe and getting her signature weapon is actually stronger than C2 on AYAKA. And this is also what you'd see a lot of speedrunners do. This Constellation 1 gives an extra elemental skill use, which is both more damage for your team and more energy generation. And then if you get her weapon, since you're already getting more energy generation, you don't really need Favonius Lance, which means you can use a weapon that has a lot higher base attack, which scales Shenhe's icy quills even further. I got AYAKA C2 just because I like playing her as a DPS. but investing first into shenhe is definitely more optimal. And if you're playing AYAKA with Furina, it is still too early for me to really know the optimizations. I think it's safe to say, just given how strong Furina's constellations are and how we already know that her C1 and C2 are priorities in a lot of other teams, I think it's safe to say, like, I'm 90% sure that getting her early constellations will probably also be stronger than getting AYAKA's early constellations. So on to one of the main topics of this video. A lot of people are wondering about AYAKA's new teams with Furina and Charlotte, its viability, strengths and weaknesses, which core is better versus her old team. So I've been testing this team quite a bit. So Furina in isolation has really good synergy potential with AYAKA. First of all, for freeze in general, Furina's AoE Hydro application, basically having 100% uptime, is very huge. It honestly makes Kokomi skill duration and Mona's skill durations just sound very bad compared to Furina's 30-second duration, but obviously that's not the full story. Then also, Furina adding her own sub DPS damage is very big too, especially doing that while still being a buffer. And theoretically, this is actually pretty huge because it can make AYAKA teams less reliant on her burst, basically carrying the entire team in older teams. Lastly, I should mention that Furina's HP drain mechanic that she has, since enemies barely hit you when you use freeze teams, the typical downside that Furina teams would have with vulnerability is very minimal here. So all that sounds really good, but the real issue is you can't just get all those benefits by simply slotting her into your existing team. Like, if you could just put Furina here, but unless you have lots of constellations, you can't really do that. And Furina's real issue is that in a lot of her teams, you have to replace another character too. And it's not that Charlotte has low synergy with AYAKA either, but I think it's that, especially with AYAKA's previous teams, this team is known for such good synergy between each character and how easy it is to rotate in these teams. And honestly, in order to add Furina, we run into issues of messing up the cohesion of the old team altogether. So it's actually been pretty difficult for AYAKA players to assess these new teams, since being an improvement over the premium team is a very high bar. For example, to play Furina, you're pretty much either playing Charlotte Kazuha or Shenhe Jean or some lower budget versions of that. And like I said, technically, if you have very high constellations, you could be playing a team like this or something like that, but I'm not going to go into that here. So straight away, I would say that one of the positives is just increased accessibility for AYAKA teams. Even if newer teams are not becoming AYAKA's new optimal team, one of the issues that we used to have is that AYAKA teams used to consist of 4 5-stars, if not 4 limited 5-stars, which is not only expensive, but also characters don't rerun constantly. So you might not even have these characters. Now, previously you were able to use Mona, who can be even stronger and more optimal than Kokomi in a lot of abysses, but she doesn't naturally heal, and you also can't guarantee Mona either. But in 4.2, we have 2 more characters to add, Furina and Charlotte. And Charlotte being a 4-star, if you are interested in the cost system, then Charlotte reducing this team's cost by 1 is pretty huge. So you can say, instead of pulling Kokomi, you can now get mistsplitter instead. And Charlotte has good constellations, but they aren't exactly adding huge damage buffs, so they're not needed. I would say that this C4 is quite big for energy generation, but it's not like Charlotte is Farizan or anything. You could also argue that Jean or Sayu are now more optimal to play than before, but even Jean is also a standard character like Mona, so that's not very ideal, but at least you're increasing the odds of getting a teammate there when you lose a 50-50. So let's discuss the actual teams, and to be honest, I do consider this team to be one of AYAKA's better teams, but I think comparing it with her best teams like with Mona or Kokomi, I think the overall issue that people have realized when testing this Furina team is that the old teams just have a lot of fluidity and flexibility that's hard to replicate. Like with Furina Charlotte, there's no real definitive setup or rotation that sticks out and makes immediate sense. I have tried some, and I have tried keeping up with discussions both in EN and CN, and no one's found anything definitive either. Just to clarify, I don't think these new setups are by any means hard to execute, but you are going from an easy to play and easy to set up team to definitely at least a more complicated team that can be frustrating. Like, I think these rotations are just so easy to remember, and you can even do setups here without using any character's burst. The main issue that Furina Charlotte has is two issues. First of all, since a lot of the new value that this team has is Furina's damage, this means that you have to do double swirl buff setups with Kazuha in order to buff and debuff for both cryo and hydro now. And if you don't, that means you're not utilizing Furina's sub DPS. Luckily, Furina's damage doesn't snapshot, so you aren't punished that much if you take a while to swirl hydro. But of course, AYAKA's damage does snapshot and it is front loaded, so you absolutely will be punished if you mess up a setup and you only buff hydro. In comparison, Kokomi and Mona basically do 0 damage. Their entire power budget is funneling everything into AYAKA, so you don't care about buffing hydro for Mona or Kokomi, and this greatly simplified your setups here. It's a lot more simple to set up to buff AYAKA. Then the other issue is in regards to Charlotte. Since she is a catalyst user and Furina is not, that means Charlotte has the opportunity to use TTDS to buff AYAKA, so she takes a bit of Kokomi and Mona's job. But there's two issues I noticed with this, because you need to switch to AYAKA straight after Charlotte in order to activate TTDS here, but you also want to have done a double swirl setup before to buff Furina and AYAKA. This means you can't use Charlotte in order to do a double swirl setup. And then number two, and I'm sure you'll have noticed this, Charlotte with her 80 energy cost burst, she does have very high energy recharge requirements, especially if you're comparing her to a character like Kokomi. And Kokomi doesn't even need to use her burst. Even Mona, her burst isn't required, whereas you need to be using Charlotte's burst regularly, or you'll stop benefiting from Furina's skill damage and her burst buffs, because your team will be on too low HP. And then lastly, if you're playing a Jean variation, then the obvious issue is that her grouping is just terrible compared to Kazuha, and even compared to Sucrose or Venti. And as you know, when you play AYAKA, having enemies properly positioned and frozen is one of the most important things to maximizing her burst and your team's damage overall. Anyway, I'll show you an example setup.
Time to shine. Strike up a tip.
One with nature.
Let my name echo in song. Hard hitting exclusive.
One with nature.
My apologies.
For this team, I do recommend higher energy recharge on Furina. For example, I can switch to these pieces. I would recommend somewhere from 190 to 200. And then Charlotte, I would say if you're using TTDS, I would recommend trying to get higher than 230 ER. And using Pavonia Sword on Kazuha will help a lot. Anyway, overall, I think AYAKA Furina has really good synergy in theory. In fact, really great synergy in theory. It's just hard to argue that a new team is an improvement over the old teams with Mona or with Kokomi. Currently, for my playtesting, the newer teams are just more complicated setups, arguably less damage, higher energy recharge requirements. Of course, if you do have constellations on Furina, then I think we could definitely be having more of a conversation. But as for C0, this is my opinion. Maybe Furina AYAKA is a team for the future if we can get teammates that fit better here. But for now, I think it's a reasonable community consensus. There is also a new mono cryo team where you play Charlotte, basically replacing Bennett in the old team. Especially if you have Bennett C6. That Pyro infusion obviously ruins AYAKA's cryo infusion, and Charlotte can also buff with TTDS. As I said before, mono cryo teams are a playstyle people should be trying if there's a lot of bosses in the Abyss. The extra damage you get from Shenhe's quills due to Charlotte being cryo is very minimal, because you're probably not stacking that much cryo damage and crit on Charlotte, but it's still something. And with 3 cryos, Charlotte's energy recharge requirements do drop, so it's a lot easier to play TCDS here to buff AYAKA. Unfortunately, I'm not confident if I can say yet whether this new team is better. I think it will take a few more abysses of testing, but it's definitely a good use case for Charlotte. There are quite a few questions wanting me to compare Wriothesley, AYAKA, Ganyu. Just for context, I play AYAKA and Ganyu a lot, but I personally skipped Wriothesley on my own account, so I've only been testing him on other people's accounts. As you might know, I honestly hate comparing different DPSs, but for this video I can elaborate on it. The thing is that this really just depends on your investment level and the type of player you are. Like, I could discuss this for casual play and with speedrunning. Like, for casual play, it's no secret that, broadly speaking, newer characters and teams are getting more easier than older ones. And Wriothesley has those cool boxing animations and he is easier to play. And whilst AYAKA Freeze is still relatively an easy team to play, as it's a freeze team that has grouping and healing, Melt Ganyu has always been one of the more harder teams to play, and the mileage that you get from Melt Ganyu can vary depending on your skill and your knowledge of her. And then in regards to speedrunning, you could also break this down into your level of investment. Like, all 3 of these DPSs slap at high constellations. Even till this day, there's many abysses where either Ganyu or AYAKA have actually been the fastest speedrun teams. And then now with C6 Wriothesley, he is also one of the strongest C6s now. Like, there's actually a meme where his C6 does so much damage that you actually don't see it on the screen before a chamber ends. I would say though that the main differences are at lower investment, which I'm sure you're more interested in, as well as the ease of play, and you can definitely make the argument that AYAKA feels the most complete with the most consistent ceiling at C0, but her weakness is having a lot of limited 5-star teammates and not really being able to be played in Melt. Whereas with Ganyu, speedrun wise, she gets a lot of value going from C0 to C1, especially with all the increased resistance enemies these days. And she has a lot of different teams you can play and master, but one of her weaknesses is that it's quite difficult to master her, probably one of the harder characters in the game. So that means even if she is strong, you might not be getting the results that you should be getting. She is also limited as a DPS, where she optimally is basically always played in Melt or very rarely in a mono cryo team. In Freeze, for the last few years, she's basically just being played as a sub DPS for AYAKA, but even then that's more of a casual thing since AYAKA speedruns barely use Ganyu. Lastly, with Wriothesley, the issue is he's been out for like 2 patches now, and if you follow speedruns you will know that honestly barely anyone is really using him to record gameplay at C0, and the ones you do see are like more casual runs. This is something that a lot of people in my Discord have noticed, and I would say that it seems Wriothesley's in a similar situation as someone like Ayato, where he hasn't really got an established best team yet at lower budgets, and that's just completely different compared to the Whales, where you see a lot of Wriothesley videos all the time and a lot of people are playing him and he's always getting strong clears. It is a bit concerning, especially compared to Neuvillette or Linny, where I do have a better idea of their best teams, and you do see a lot of gameplay all the time at different ranges of investments and different ranges of skill levels. So someone's asking about Cryo's overall place in the meta and where AYAKA fits. There's also another question about how cryo is not an element at the center of the meta. To be honest, the issue is that there are just 100 definitions of meta, and everything is just way too dependent on your personal beliefs, your account's investment level, and what values you have. To be honest, there's never really an answer to these type of questions. Like, for example, if I could tell you about the most meta of meta strategy, and right now the strat is to just skip every character and save for a Neuvillette rerun, maybe Linny. Like, if I were to tell you, that's unironically what a lot of the discussion is right now, because Neuvillette is just the easiest DPS to play. He requires the least RNG even to make a video, and you can get insane speed runs with both Linny and Novilla at any cost bracket, every level of constellation. So Novilla in particular works for basically every type of player. And obviously you can see in things like usage rates that Novilla is really popular for that. But obviously that's a very hardcore optimal mindset and probably not the discussion you guys are looking for. But at the same time, everything less hardcore than that is just subjective, isn't it? Another question is asking, who would you use her C4 with? What interesting teams would you make? AYAKA C4 is really strong with its defense shred, but honestly it doesn't really change much outside of playing some melt nuke teams, which are quite popular. You often see Hu Tao or Yen Fei or maybe D-Luke. But aside from that, as a DPS, you pretty much just play AYAKA in the same teams as before. You just do more damage, really. Another question is a comparison between her Hydra options like Kokomi, Mona, Furina. First of all, if you do want the most in-depth comparisons, then you can just browse the Hydro section of my written guide. But I can give you a brief comparison here. Kokomi has strong healing, which is built into her kit. She also has very fast animations. You just need to use her elemental skill. And faster animations means faster setups and faster front-loaded damage. She also has longer lasting freeze compared to Mona, whose elemental skill does last a shorter time. Kokomi's longer elemental skill also means that she has a longer tenacity of the millilith buff than Mona. But out of these Hydra characters, I would say that Kokomi relies the most on freeze in order to serve her purpose, since a lot of her value is in the very good freeze and the damage increases that you get alongside that. Whereas with Mona, she only heals if you are using prototype Amber on her, but a lot of people just play healerless and use TTDS. If you're using Mona's burst and her skill, then she has longer setups than Kokomi, which means your team's damage windows can start later. But you can save her burst when you need it and just use her skill in certain fights, which can speed up Mona's setups quite a lot. Also, by definition, the shorter elemental skill does mean she has longer freeze downtime. This can be very noticeable compared to Kokomi and now Furina. But Mona's 12-second E, if you look at that, compared to Kokomi's 20-second cooldown. That means that Mona can have faster turnarounds in multi-wave fights. And lastly, if you do factor in TTDS and the Omen buff, then Mona does have a higher peak damage than Kokomi. Now Furina, she is a sub DPS, which is a big departure from the other two who basically deal no damage. Furina also has huge team-wide buffs from her elemental burst, but this might be limited in application, as in a lot of freeze teams you're only really getting damage from AYAKA. Furina also has a very long skill, basically 100% uptime, but her Hydra application is not as regular as Kokomi's, so you will experience some downtime in freeze. She also needs to be buffed in order to benefit properly from a sub DPS damage, so she requires a lot more technical setups than Kokomi or Mona. And lastly, as we've covered throughout the video, Furina is a lot more particular with her teams, so she is much more restricted with teammates. Another question is asking about AYAKA, Shenhe, Furina and Charlotte. Is that in contention for her best team, or is Kazuha and Kokomi straight up better? So they're talking about this team, which is 3 cryos and 1 hydro. And no, I can't really say this is her best team for a few reasons. Firstly, AYAKA's burst needs grouping in AoE, and even if you aren't doing any AoE fights, like say for example the current abyss, that means you're probably fighting bosses, but bosses are unfreezable, which means you're playing Furina not for the freeze but for her buffs and her sub DPS. The issue is that more and more bosses have increased resistances now, like Ice Wind Sweet, this Emperor of Fire and Iron, and even the Seahorse has increased resistances. So why I'm mentioning that is, with normal comparisons, Kazuha's VV debuff, you're going from dealing 90% of your damage if enemies have 10% resistance to doing 1.15 times your damage. So that means in normal circumstances, you're increasing your damage by about 28% by using Kazuha's VV. But with higher res enemies, like say 70% for example resistance, Like a lot of the bosses I mentioned have like 70 or maybe even higher at some points. You're going from dealing 30% of your damage to now 70% of your damage because you just remove 40% of the resistance from VV. And 30% to 70% is actually increase of 2.3 times of your damage, which is quite a big difference to what Kazuha was bringing to the table at 10% resistance. So what this means is Kazuha is normally a strong buffer in your teams, as you know, but the higher the enemy's resistance, he gets even more stronger. And not to mention that Shenhe herself also has cryo res decreases. That means in comparison, a character like Furina, even though she gives a ton of buffs to your teams, damage buffs like this, which don't scale the more resistance an enemy has, it's hard for it to compare. Another question is the importance of Shenhe's C1 in AYAKA speedruns. Shenhe's C1 is not important in the sense that you absolutely do need it, but it is important in the sense that it's just very strong. Like I covered earlier in the video, this gives your team more damage and it gives your team more energy generation, so it helps in two ways. Especially if you're defeating enemies in one cycle, the difference between 3 elemental skills and 2 is quite significant. And as we've covered already, in a team like this, after you've got mistsplitter, so many speedrunners get Shenhe's C1 and then Shenhe's signature weapon before they even worry about a weapon on Kazuha or C2 on AYAKA. If you are someone who does get constellations, then it's a very big optimization. There's a few questions asking about how valuable mistsplitter is compared to Finale and how much DPS she gains and just weapon calcs in general. I did post a video a while ago about this, but I've done weapon calcs on the new craftable weapon from Fontaine and how it's an upgrade over Anemo Kageichi. So before, if you did a comparison of mistsplitter versus R5 Anemo Kageichi, it was 24% stronger than the free-to-play craftable, slightly higher or slightly less depending on the team buffs as I've calculated here. But now that Finale of the Deep is 110%, that means that now in Fontaine, mistsplitter is only 15% stronger than the free-to-play craftable, as long as you are able to clear this life bond. But to be honest, 15% stronger is still quite a big deal, especially as AYAKA, unless you're playing her with Furina, AYAKA is basically doing all of your team's damage. So with the old teams, this is basically a 15% increase to your entire team's damage. Not to mention that mistsplitter is basically a permanent upgrade to AYAKA. You basically use this in every situation if you have it. Whereas other weapons like Finale of the Deep, it does have more restrictions. Like you do need to be playing a team where you can clear this life bond. So you can't be playing teams with weak healers, or you can't be playing healerless teams. It also does have lower base attack. So even in my calcs, mistsplitter will scale better with attack buffs. Mistsplitter will be able to scale the best the more substats you have in your artifacts. So yeah, I would say that mistsplitter is still a very valuable weapon, and also it can be played on a lot of different characters. It's a good universal weapon in general, so I don't really think its value has dropped now that Finale exists. And as we've mentioned in the video throughout, Shenhe is still in AYAKA's best teams, at least at the moment. So depending on how much primos you got and how you value spending your primos, I can't really answer if she's worth putting for you. That will be a decision you'll have to make. But it is worth considering that you don't need Shenhe, especially if you do have Furina and Charlotte already from putting on Furina's banner. Then you can obviously play this team that doesn't use Shenhe at all. But maybe in the future there can be even better synergies to where you can play Furina, AYAKA, Shenhe. Maybe if there's a healer that can replace Kazuha in this team. So I wouldn't write off Shenhe just yet, even if you do have Furina and vice versa. You never know if you are able to play all 3 of them. First of all, I'll show you my AYAKA build and what I'm working with. I have mistsplitter, I have pretty good artifacts, you can see my pieces here. And then I have a crit damage circlet. And I also have an attack circlet if I want to use that. These are my overall stats. In most teams, you're generally looking for around 130 or 140 ER on AYAKA. But if you have something like C1 on Shenhe, which I don't have, then you can often even build much lower than this. I have her at C2. I used to have her at C0 for a long time, but her last rerun I got her at C2 and then triple crowned obviously. And then now there's this new team here. So someone's asking what stats they should aim for mistsplitter on. I would say like if you can get above 2000 attack, if you can have 130 to 140 energy recharge, really you kind of just want to use your best pieces. Ayaka doesn't really use that many substats. She uses crit damage, crit rate, attack, and energy recharge, and that's pretty much it. So there's not really that much to her optimization aside from just getting lucky with your pieces and getting as much of those stats as possible. You can see a piece like this is actually pretty good just because everything went into energy recharge and crit damage. But Blizzard Strayer in general is just not the easiest set to build because you also get increased crit rate from here and from cryo res, so it's very easy to overcap. So not only does she only have a few substats for you to use, but you also don't want too much crit rate too. So yeah, this is what I'm using at the moment. Hopefully that's helpful for you. And yeah, last question, what is her best anemo teammate outside of Kazuha or Venti? And how should we deal with Furina's inconsistency in Ayaka teams? First of all, her best teammate outside of Kazuha or Venti is probably Sucrose, just because the grouping is just that important for Ayaka. If you're in an AoE fight and you want to utilize her burst properly, you need the grouping. Which means, to be honest, if an anemo doesn't have good grouping, it's just a big downside. And how should we deal with Furina's inconsistency in Ayaka's teams? Honestly, with my testing, you kind of just have to freestyle and play around the double swirl. I do find it's a good idea to attack enemies with Ayaka right before you swirl with Kazuha, and that will just give you the best chance of swirling both cryo and hydro, and you want to keep doing that as frequently as you can. But one of the good things with Furina is that her elemental skill just lasts such a long time. Like 30 seconds is just so much longer than we've ever had before, and that means you don't need to be worrying as much anymore about having enemies frozen, because if enemies are not frozen, then they probably will be frozen very soon. So in that way, Furina can be easier to play. But yeah, as I've said throughout this video, I don't think this team is the final form of Furina and Ayaka. So if these new freeze teams are feeling a bit clunky now, then there always is a chance that they will feel better in the future. So that's it for the FAQ. Thanks for sending in all the questions. Hopefully I managed to answer your questions. If not, like I said, I've got a lot more videos and a lot more guides you can also check. And if you are pulling Ayaka in her rerun, then good luck on your pulls. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and bye for now.